After finding her way to the base of the mountain, Melody spent a great deal of time searching around. Weeks, in fact, trying to find the perfect location to settle down. When you're trying to survive on your own, finding the perfect location is paramount. So, Melody put a great deal of effort into the matter, spending those weeks scouting the entire location around the base of the mountain, keeping a constant eye for geography, plant life, animals, sources of water, and possible locations where she could begin to settle in, eventually finding what she believed to be the optimum place. Finding a location around the base of the mountain where there was a sizable cavern, a cave in which there was a great deal of interior space, enough so that if she were to put some effort into it, she could carve out a reasonable living inside and have a fair amount of safety. With a little bit of work, she could add some sort of doorway that would seal off the exterior, as well as some sort of chimney. The entrance to the cavern was quite wide, so moving some stones about in order to affix a wood-burning stove and kitchen would be excellent, and magic would definitely help with the task. She had been taught a spell that would allow her to move heavy objects, and as she thought about the design for her new house, the reason for this spell became fairly obvious, along with its other many practical uses. But the cavern wasn't the only thing that made this a good place to settle. There was also plenty of nearby wooded area, so there would be lots of animals and game to hunt. There was a sizable stream very nearby that ran down from the upper levels of the mountain, with crystal clear, freezing cold water, and an ample supply of it at that, and plenty of room for fish to be in the stream. It was in fact no trouble at all catching a few. And so, weary from her travels and all of the work of trying to find a proper place to settle down, Melody finally found the perfect home, and with child in hand, she set about making it so. Years passed in that place as Melody slowly made that cavern in the side of the mountain her home, affixing it with all of the creature comforts that she could afford, even widening it out to have more space. She began to bring in clippings from nearby trees, like apple trees, using small spells that her mother taught her that would allow her to force growth from vegetation. It was simple enough to create trees and bushes and other such plants that would bear fruit and vegetables, so they had plenty of food. And she even had a magical spell that would allow her to create cloth from the pelts of animals without the heavy manual labor that is normally required. So eventually she built a respectable collection of clothing for both herself and her child, as well as being to outfit the interior of her house with creature comforts like beds that were nice and soft, pillows, drapes that made the place feel homey. Yes, with magic in hand, she began to forge a very good life at the base of that mountain. In the end, she decided to name the child Talion, a strong name. She did want him to grow up to be a strong man, and though she did have her concerns that perhaps he might develop differently than she expected, despite those concerns, Talion grew to be a very caring and loving child, as well as a bit mischievous, as most children tend to be. They would often spend their time together playing small games, talking amongst each other, whilst doing the things that they needed to in order to maintain their life. She taught Talion to hunt, to fish, all of the basic things that he needed to survive. She also taught him to read and write, basic math skills, also things that would come quite in handy should he ever need them. And Talion seemed to be happy with his life, living there with his mother, a joyous young boy who spent much of his time running around the forests around his house, doing things that children would normally do, playing with small animals, fishing, catching fireflies. But there were many notable differences between Talion and a regular child that his mother had no choice but to take note of. For example, Talion's quite inhuman strength. At first, she didn't notice it at all. I mean, Talion seemed like a normal boy, despite his strange eyes and the tail. But one day, whilst gathering bait for fishing, Melody told Talion that sometimes small insects that can be useful for fishing, and worms and things of that nature, can be found under rocks. So to try to check a few. Whilst she was checking some small stones nearby, she heard a sizable rumbling sound and the shifting of stones, and turned around to find Talion lifting a very large stone out of the ground, even tearing the earth around it up as he pulled it from its cozy earthbound nest. It was massive, nearly 10 times his size, and yet seemingly almost without effort. Talion ripped the stone right out of the ground, his fingers digging into the rock. He did so as if it were nothing at all, like a simple child picking up a rock. He thought nothing of it. His mother told him to look under a rock, and so he did. He was a bit concerned with the expression on Melody's face when he did. Mom, are you okay? I mean, I don't see any bugs under this one. I could go check another one. No, Talion, that's fine. Why don't you put that down? I wouldn't want you to hurt yourself. Okay, he said, as he put the rock down abruptly. A large smashing sound as he dropped it without care. That was the first time that Melody recognized Talion's inhuman strength. She also began to notice small physical differences other than his tail and the color of his eyes. Talion began to grow teeth like any other child. However, after his teeth began to truly come in, she began to notice that he had several very sharp, long teeth that were larger than the others, like razor-sharp fangs on the top and bottom. They weren't so dramatically oversized that they looked off. Unless Talion were to smile, you would never know he had them. But if he did, those gleaming white teeth with razor-sharp points on them were extremely apparent. She also noticed that Talion's nails did not grow in like a normal person's. Rather, they grew only to a certain extent. She actually attempted to clip his nails once, only to find that there simply wasn't a material hard enough to cut them. If she tried, whatever she tried with would simply be cut instead. Both Talion's teeth and his nails seemed to be strong enough to puncture basically anything. He could chew through stone or steel, seemingly with ease. It wasn't something that he liked to eat, but if push came to shove, he could take a chomp out of just about anything. Talion's incredible agility and other somewhat primal-like behaviors also became notable. For example, when Talion was very young, she attempted to spook him a bit, sneak up on him and give him a scare. Just for laughs, of course. And she succeeded. However, the response was not as she expected it. She quickly found that Talion leaped nearly 15 foot from where he was standing, lodging himself upon the top of a tree, clasping into it with his nails so tightly that he wouldn't come down. It took her nearly 10 minutes to settle him. Afterwards, she found that Talion could basically crawl on anything. Being a somewhat mischievous child, he would often take to trying to scare her in exchange. She did give him the idea, after all. So he would routinely hang from the ceilings, or creep up along the side of a wall to try to give her a spook. Aside from that, Talion was a very healthy young boy. In fact, almost too healthy. No matter the weather or conditions, whether it was cold or hot, Talion seemed completely unfazed by the weather. He could stand barefoot in the snow and not be cold, stand on a stone that's been beaten by the sun all day and not be burned. He actually gave his mother quite the scare at one point in time when she asked him to fetch the stew from the fire, and he did, except, unlike Melody expected, Talion did not pick the iron pot from the fire by the handle, nor did he use any sort of covering or mitt. He simply reached his hands into the fire, grasping the pot by its base and lifting it out. Once again, this did not bother Talion at all. The bottom of the iron pot was scalding hot. Any human being who touched it would be left with horrible scars. And yet Talion simply placed the pot upon the stone shelf and dusted off his hands as if nothing happened, and simply continued to play. She also began to notice that Talion didn't have a problem with night. After asking him about why it was that he was able to be so active during the night and move around so quickly, Talion explained it to her, that for whatever the reason, he could simply see at night, very clearly, almost no different than it were during the day. He could even see things hiding in shadows that were too dark for any normal person to see into. He did not require light. All of these things were, of course, interesting and somewhat concerning to Melody, but none so much as the final difference that she noticed. That being that around the age of 7 or 8, Talion began to, belch fire. At first it was only just in small amounts, but eventually Talion became capable of spewing a gout of fire that, if he were to aim at a human being, would no doubt render them nothing but a smoldering pile of ashes, catching fire to basically anything. But despite all of these differences, Talion simply acted like any normal child would. He had abilities that made him capable of things that a normal child wasn't. But his mind, his behavior, and even his personality simply reflected that of a loving young boy. He even had a great deal of kindness, befriending many of the small creatures that inhabit the area. All in all, Melody and Talion had a good life there at the base of that mountain. And finally, the time arose that Melody felt that Talion was old enough to begin learning magic.